What we're looking at here is the Striker foot pod disassembled. I'm going to quickly cover each of the components. This is the SparkFun FIO board with the XB Series 2 module plugged directly into the board via the XB socket. You see a micro USB port which allows for charging and pushing new code into the board. You have the standard JST connector. This is where we plug in our lithium-ion battery. There's a convenient on-off switch on the board already. This is the actual enclosure for the board that we've custom made with a 3D model and then printed this out with our MakerBot replicator. On the bottom, there's a hole that's been pre-sized to allow this USB connector to be exposed whenever the unit is inside so that it can be charged without pulling everything apart. On the bottom is a Velcro strap that runs through two holes on the bottom of the board, or on the bottom of the enclosure. This basically wraps around the shoelace to hold this in place whenever it's secured to the shoe. Flipping this around, you'll see here that there are quick disconnects so that we can easily pop this on and off the shoe. The theory being that we could swap this with other shoes fairly easily. Of course, every shoe would need a pressure pad inside it. We've seen this in some pictures before, but basically inside this shoe there is a pressure pad which moves out the side through a small hole, and then we have a custom terminal connector which runs up through these two wires through the disconnects into a little PCB board where we have our 10K resistor for reading from the FIO through the 10K resistor into the pressure pad. There's also a small top. While the enclosure is hard plastic, this small top is actually printed using the Ninja Flex, and so it is actually flexible, and so this goes well over the top of this enclosure and holds it in place. Here's the foot pod fully assembled and attached to the running shoe, and you can see our disconnects are firmly pinned together. The Velcro is now attached, holding the board in place. You can see that the lid is on, stays nice and snug on there. For comparison's sake, let's have a look at the other shoe. This is the traditional Garmin foot pod that just kind of snaps around the shoelaces, and so the goal was to build something similar and to keep it as close to size as we could, roughly anyway. So there you can see side by side. This is the wristwatch portion of Striker. I've got the lid pulled slightly off so that I can show you the internals with them all wired up. I won't be able to completely pull this apart because everything is very tightly squeezed into this small space, so I'll do my best to show you each of the components. The first thing on the outside is to notice that we're using the Ninja Flex filament. This is a more rubberized elastic filament versus the hard plastic. I have a separate one that I printed here, and so you can actually see me sort of squeeze it and bend it and mold it. What you can see is these already have grooves for the nub of the other side of the wristwatch to be able to basically plug, through a hole and then secure into place. On the other side of the wristwatch, we've got just a small piece of Velcro wrapped around and glued on. This acts as like a wristwatch, band so that we can push the other side through and it will stay in place. The next thing you'll notice is a hole in the top of the lid, which is basically a pre-cut section so that the OLED screen will be able to shine through or kind of poke through the top of the device. Taking a look inside, we see here, this is the SparkFun Pro Micro board. This is the XB Series 2 module for our wireless connectivity. Sticking out right here is our power cell. I've also put together a custom battery holder on the bottom, and this holds our 3.7 volt battery. There's a small plastic piece that sits on top of this, kind of keeps some of the heat from the battery off of the device. The battery comes in through the power cell, which takes the 3.7 volt signal and boosts it to a 5 volt, which is required by our Pro Micro. The Pro Micro is wired into the XB for the wireless connectivity, and they all run through this PCB board and then eventually into what's sort of exposed at the very inside top right there. This is the OLED screen wired back into the rest of the components. Here's a side-by-side comparison of my Garmin 910 XT, which is what I use for most of my training, and Striker. Of course, one of our goals was to try to keep the watch and the FootPod, within the same ballpark size of a traditional sports watch. You can obviously see the Striker is a bit bigger. Our components are off the shelf, and obviously we don't have sort of the same R&D budget that a company like Garmin does. The thickness, obviously the 910 XT is quite a bit thinner, but you will see here, this is the Ninja Flex lid that we talked about. It fits nicely over the enclosure and stays in place very well. On the outside of the enclosure, there are two holes that have been made inside the 3D model. The first one is for the power cell USB port, which allows us to charge the device from the outside. The second feature is the on-off switch, which wires into the battery and the power cell, and obviously can turn the device completely on or completely off. At this point, I'm going to turn the device on and allow you to see the custom boot sequence that we've programmed, and then I'll explain the data that's being shown. At this point, it says locating FootPod. What it's actually doing is trying to pair up with the FootPod on the shoe. This can take up to a minute sometimes. At some point, it's not actually pairing for the FootPod, but what it really waits for is about the first minute. You're typically just walking around or warming up or whatever as you're getting ready to run. So it's going to ignore the first minute worth of data as you walk around, and then by then it figures you're running, and then it's going to start calculating the proper cadence. So at this point, the pairing of the FootPod is complete. What you see is a toggling of two different screens. The first screen is showing us two numbers. It's our current cadence and our average cadence. The current cadence is the actual recorded cadence from 1 minute ago. The average cadence is held across the entire time that the device is on, so obviously the entire time of your run. The second screen is an update indicator, and it's basically telling you how long you have left until the next update occurs. At the next update, it will update the current from the last 60 seconds, and then it will recalculate the average over the entire time. At this point, you're probably wondering where this data is coming from, since I'm not actually running. I've just set up some sample data so that I could do this demo. In the next phase, we'll show you an actual live demo. Alright, we're about to do the final test of Striker. I've got it strapped to my wrist, and I've got the FootPod on my shoe, and we're going to do a couple minutes of running. So it looks like a successful test. So there you go. We got, after about 3 minutes of running, an 86 for my last minute, and a 78 for my average. Accounting for the fact that I got up to speed a little slow on the treadmill, and that first minute when I wasn't actually running, the average would come up over time, but 86 is pretty close. We want to be right around that 90, and that was an easy pace on the treadmill, so 86 is pretty nice.